In the summer of 1979, during a performance, Neil Diamond collapsed right on stage. Not because he was drunk, not because of scandal, but because of a tumor pressed close to his spine. Something that could have stolen his voice, his career, even his ability to stand. The lights stayed on. The audience still didn't understand what was happening. But for Neil Diamond, that moment was the first time he saw a brutal truth with absolute clarity. Talent does not grant a person immunity from collapse. He was the man who wrote songs that made millions of Americans hold each other and sing in happiness. Sweet Caroline rang out in stadiums, bars, weddings, places where a crowd becomes one voice. Yet behind those collective choruses was a man who often left the stage in silence, carrying exhaustion, loneliness, and private fragments of a life quietly breaking apart. Things the audience never got to see. Neil Diamond's life was built from contradictions that were never easy to reconcile. A musical genius who constantly doubted himself. A symbol of mass joy who repeatedly lost his family. A man who made hundreds of millions of dollars from music, yet more than once had no idea what to cling to when the lights went out. Success came early, and it came huge, and the price arrived in equal measure. Marriages that fell apart, nights of sheer depletion, moments when his body betrayed his will. And then, decades later, when Parkinson's forced him away from the stage, the question was no longer how great Neil Diamond truly was. It became, how much pain does a human being have to endure in order to become the beautiful memory of an entire nation? The moment a person confronts the limits of the body often pulls memory back to where everything began. Before there was Sweet Caroline, before an entire nation sang along to a melody so familiar it feels as though it has existed forever, Neil Diamond was simply a boy, growing up in small Brooklyn apartments, where people lived so close together you could hear a neighbor's sigh through the wall. Neil Diamond was born on January 24, 1941, in Brooklyn, New York, into an immigrant Jewish family shaped by discipline and frugality. The cramped apartment, the constant moving, and the low, persistent sense of instability left little space in his childhood for carefree dreaming. His father went off to serve in the war, leaving behind a long silence inside the family. His mother was forced to carry everything alone, firm, quiet, and uncomplaining. For a few years, Neil was taken away from New York to live in Wyoming, a land so wide it was overwhelming, yet it only made his loneliness grow faster. In that vast emptiness, the boy learned how to listen to the world through silence. When he returned to Brooklyn, Neil became even more withdrawn. He wasn't loud, wasn't noticeable, often standing at the edge of conversations. Movie theaters and the melodies on the screen became his safest refuge. There, emotions were allowed to exist without having to be explained. When he held his first guitar as a teenager, Neil did not treat it like a toy. Those evenings of playing alone felt like a way of holding himself together, each slow chord forming a private space that no one else could enter. At Erasmus Hall, surrounded by faces that were also searching for a way out of Brooklyn, Neil began to realize that music might be the most enduring path, not to become famous, but to avoid living a life swept away by forces beyond his control. That thought followed him into the university years, when he attempted to pursue medicine as the safe option. But deep down, that safety always carried the scent of a borrowed life, one that didn't truly belong to him. And out of that feeling, Neil Diamond slowly moved closer to the choice that would shape everything that came after. From the instability that had followed him since childhood, Neil Diamond entered the age of choosing through a path safe enough to reassure his family. He enrolled at New York University as a pre-med student, even earning a fencing scholarship, signs of a life that seemed on track. But inside lecture halls and anatomy textbooks What Neil heard most clearly was not the rhythm of the human heart, but the melody running through his own mind. Outside class hours, he carried his guitar to Tin Pan Alley, where cramped rooms were packed with ambition and indifference. Neil played for people, asked for a listen, then walked away in silence. Doors did not slam shut dramatically. They simply closed again and again, without ceremony. In 1960, he made a decision that stunned his family. He left NYU with only 10 credits short of graduation. Neil chose music with no safety net beneath him. His first job was as a staff songwriter at Sunbeam Music Publishing for $50 a week. He wrote fast, wrote constantly, wrote on demand, inside a small office with an old piano in the middle of a New York winter. Some songs were rejected for being too sad, others for being too different. His honesty collided with an industry addicted to formulas. Not long after, Sunbeam ended his contract. Neil Diamond entered the most invisible period of his life, young, poor, unknown. At times he lived on just a few dimes a day, sleeping in makeshift spaces above jazz clubs. The city still rang with music, only it wasn't meant for him yet. But he didn't stop, not because of some vague hope, but because beyond writing he had nothing else left that could keep him standing. In 1962, the single Clown Town was released and quickly disappeared. That failure didn't make him change direction. By 1965, one record label decided to take a gamble. Bang Records signed Neil. A year later, his debut album, The Feel of Neil, was released, enough to establish his name in the business. Around the same time, Neil wrote I'm a Believer, recorded by the Monkees and exploding into a phenomenon, lifting him into the top tier of hitmakers. Early success brought pressure to repeat the same formula. When the demands of the market began to overpower what he actually wanted to say, Neil left Bang for Uni Records in 1967. From there, everything accelerated. Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show introduced a striking new stage flavor. Cracklin' Rosie in 1970 took him to #1 on the pop charts. And I Said in 1971 earned his first Grammy nomination, a confirmation that behind the mainstream melodies was a voice not easily replaced. He once wrote music in rooms so cold that dreams could only exist as a whisper. And yet just a few years later, those melodies poured across America, echoing from car radios in rush-hour traffic, neon-lit bars, corner jukeboxes, and weddings where people held hands and sang as if the song had belonged to their lives for decades. The world began to hear Neil Diamond, and from that moment on, a quiet paradox began to show itself. The louder the crowd sang, the more alone Neil became. The first explosion did not even carry his own voice. In 1966, I'm a Believer, performed by the Monkees, erupted into a global phenomenon, dominating charts everywhere and turning its songwriter into the architect of a mass obsession. But the spotlight landed on someone else. Neil watched his song race around the world, then returned to Manhattan, facing the same familiar room and the same unchanged emptiness. That success taught him something cold. If he kept writing only for others, he would remain behind the curtain forever. So he began writing for himself. Solitary Man was not designed for radio, nor built to flatter the market. It was written like a bare confession, about loneliness, about the price of living too long on the margins. The song didn't need noise to survive. It laid the foundation for the portrait of Neil Diamond, an artist capable of turning the hardest emotions into melodies in which other people could recognize themselves. Then in 1969, from a single Ordinary Image, he wrote Sweet Caroline. That song didn't stop at being heard. It was meant to be sung with. The chorus spread like a collective reflex, pulling thousands of people into one shared voice. From that moment, the song slipped out of the songwriter's hands and became a cultural habit. The irony was that Neil often left the stage in silence, carrying the sensation that he had created belonging for the whole world, while he himself still stood outside it. By the 1970s, Neil Diamond was no longer a passing sensation. He became a true hit-making machine. Radio was overtaken, sales surged, the touring schedule became relentless. The peak of his stage power arrived in 1972 at the Greek Theater in Los Angeles, where 10 sold-out nights were recorded as the live album Hot August Night. It sold millions of copies and remained on the Australian charts for nearly 2 years, an achievement that didn't need shouting to prove itself. While audiences saw fireworks, Neil could feel the fire slowly burning through his body. After each show, the dressing room door closed, sweat drained away, his throat burned raw, and silence returned like a familiar obligation. The fame kept swelling. Broadway called him with sold-out nights at the Winter Garden Theater. Columbia Records placed a multi-million-dollar contract on the table, a number that felt almost unreal to a man who once survived on a few dimes a day. But the higher he climbed, the more Neil forced himself into a machine that never stopped. Rehearsing, revising, recording, perfecting every detail until there were moments he looked into the mirror and could no longer recognize himself outside the role of work. In 1973, he stepped into film with the score for Jonathan Livingston Seagull. The movie collapsed, but the music won, bringing him a Grammy. What hurt Neil wasn't the film's failure. It was that his music had been rearranged against his will. The feeling of someone touching the most private thing inside him made him shut that door tightly, at least until Hollywood played its final card. The Jazz Singer in 1980 was a major gamble. The film was criticized, controversy erupted, but the music once again pulled Neil back. Love on the Rocks, Hello Again, America outlived every sneer. The cost was elsewhere, a stretched touring calendar, packed recording sessions, pain pushed aside. There were nights he walked onto the stage burning with fever, dragging himself forward with nothing but willpower, just to keep the wheel of success from slowing down. And then, in the middle of a performance, the pain tore through his spine. His breath stopped short. His body betrayed him. The microphone fell. The lights seemed to freeze. The diagnosis laid everything bare: a tumor near his spinal cord, a surgery lasting hours, the risk of losing his voice, the very thing that had defined his life. Outside the operating room, Neil wrote letters to his children because for the first time, he could not be sure he would return the same as before. When he woke up, the room was blinding white, his throat dry and burning, an unbearable silence pressing down. He tried to speak, waiting for sound to answer him. In that moment, what Neil held on to wasn't fame. It was the right to remain himself, even if the price of standing at the top had already gone far beyond what a body could carry. After the surgery, Neil Diamond returned to the stage as if he had never fallen. He still sang, still made thousands of people join in on every chorus. But each time the lights went out and the backstage door closed, Neil stepped back into a different kind of emptiness. One where fame no longer worked. There, he slowly realized that success doesn't only wear down the body, it also quietly drains away the one person who once believed in him when he had nothing to trade. That person was Jay Posner. They had known each other since high school at Erasmus Hall, before music became a career and before Neil learned how to live inside long stretches of travel. Jay was a local school teacher, ordinary in the best sense, raised in Brooklyn and used to stable rhythms and things that could be held on to. That very ordinariness once gave Neil a rare sense of safety. a kind of anchor against the unease he had carried since childhood. They married in 1963 in a small, almost private wedding, when both of them were still poor, and still believed. Their life together began in Massapequa, in a 1.5-story wooden house in the Biltmore Shores neighborhood. Neil wrote music in the basement. Jay managed the meals, the expenses, the everyday survival. There was no glamour in that house, but there was presence, something that would later become a luxury. Their 2 daughters were born in 1964 and 1966, and for a while that family still functioned as a complete unit. Neil making music, Jay mothering, everything revolving around keeping the rhythm of life from falling apart. Then the hits exploded. Recording schedules tightened, tours stretched longer, and absence became a habit. Neil bought an additional apartment in New York for work. Massapequa slowly turned into a place of waiting. There was no betrayal, no dramatic climax, only distance accumulating day after day, and a man who increasingly belonged to the public more than to his own household. Jay stayed, raising the children while holding together a marriage that was wearing away in silence. By 1969, they divorced. No spectacle, no public dispute. Neil walked away from the house whose basement had once been the first space where his songwriting truly began, leaving behind a broken family in which no one was guilty enough to be blamed. And from that moment on, Neil Diamond began living fully inside the greatest paradox of his life. He could make an entire nation sing along, yet he could not keep the people who were waiting for him at home. The ink on the signature of his first divorce papers had barely cooled when Neil Diamond's life veered into another direction, so fast that even he may not have been sure he had time to steady himself. Almost parallel to the ending with Jay Posner, one name began to appear with steady regularity in the orbit of his life: Marcia Murphy. Although rumors about when she entered Neil's life have existed for years, Marcia did not arrive like a conquest or a moral upheaval. She appeared quietly, at the exact moment a man learning how to survive after a collapse needed a presence that didn't demand anything. Marcia was a television production assistant, young, private, and not dazzled by the lights. She saw Neil not the way the public was beginning to see him, an icon on the rise, but as a man still awkward in his personal life, someone who could make a whole crowd sing in unison, yet had no idea how to handle the silence inside himself. Neil met Marcia at the intersection of endings and beginnings, when fame was growing large enough to overwhelm him, while his inner life was still breathless from promises already lost. Marcia didn't try to fix him. She stayed. And it was that patience that made Neil believe that this time he could keep moving forward without dropping everything behind him. They married in 1969. Neil moved to Los Angeles, living in Laurel Canyon, a space far enough to escape the noise, yet close enough to work. In the early years, life regained a rhythm he had once lost. Quiet mornings, a piano always ready, sheet music scattered on the table, and a woman who didn't require him to prove who he was. It was one of the rare periods when Neil was allowed to slow down, to write music like a man who had a home to return to. 2 sons were born, Jesse in 1970, Micah in 1978. For a time, that family existed like a steady pulse beneath the rising tide of his career. Neil carried photos of his children inside his guitar case, recorded their small voices, kept fragments of private life as a rope tying him back to the ground. He believed he had finally learned the old lesson, that he could hold on to the dream without having to trade away love. But fame doesn't come to share. The 1970s pulled Neil into a machine that never stopped. Albums, tours, studios, airports, stages, stacked so tightly that private life existed only in the gaps. He gave the world all his energy, his devotion, songs that made other people stand back up. In return, he slowly lost the most basic thing of all, his presence at home. The tragedy didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as absence, prolonged until it became normal. Marcia held the household together while the road swallowed her husband. She raised their sons through her own presence, through the remaining pieces of their father. A few short phone calls, promises of coming home late, dinners set with an extra place at the table. Jesse and Micah grew up inside a familiar paradox. Their father's voice was everywhere, but he himself was always somewhere else. Marcia waited in silence, because for many years, faith was the only thing that kept the marriage standing under the weight of fame. By the late 1980s, the cracks could no longer be hidden. Neil was exhausted, physically and mentally. After living too long inside noise, he began to lose his rhythm with the quietness of family life. The marriage didn't wear out through shouting, but through conversations that grew shorter, silences that stretched longer even when they were sitting right beside each other. In 1995, after 26 years of trying to hold a balance that was almost impossible, they divorced. The figure, $150 million, shocked the public. But for Neil, what weighed heavier was a failure that was deeply private. He didn't defend himself, didn't blame anyone. He simply admitted a truth that had already echoed from the first marriage. No stage can buy back a night you didn't come home. When asked about the split, he answered briefly, Marcia deserved every cent. After that, the house grew quiet. Jesse was grown. Micah became more withdrawn, looking at the world through a camera lens. Neil held his sons with the helplessness of a man who had spent his whole life healing other people, yet couldn't hold on to the most important closeness of all. He understood his sons loved him, and he also understood why they had once lacked him. And that recognition, late but true, stayed with Neil Diamond like a low note that never fades. After the divorce from Marcia in 1995, Neil Diamond did not collapse in the way people typically imagine an artist falling apart after losing a family. He kept touring, kept recording, kept smiling for the camera as a professional reflex, but his private life quietly hollowed out. So gradually, so persistently, it began to feel like part of his body. 26 years is long enough to call a place home, and when home disappears, what remains is not freedom, but a stubborn, lingering silence. He was richer, more famous, yet less touched by human presence, and he began to fear the silence inside his own room. In 1996, at 55, Neil still had applause, but the stage no longer filled every empty space. Between performances, the silences grew longer, heavier. He had spent his whole life on the road, accumulating fame the way other people accumulate memories, yet he didn't know where to place it once the lights went out. And in Australia, he met Ray Farley, a woman who didn't see a legend, but saw a man who had forgotten how to rest. Ray was a calm businesswoman, unmoved by the spotlight. She didn't try to heal Neil. She simply stayed close long enough that he didn't have to perform. The relationship didn't explode. It formed through habit, through unhurried mornings, through the quiet peace of small things. For the first time in years, Neil realized he could still write love songs from the present, not only from memory. Home was no longer an address. It was a person. Around 2003, Ray suffered a back injury and entered a long series of surgeries. This time, Neil did not keep running forward. He stayed, not out of obligation, but because for the first time he understood that love isn't in promises. It's in who sits beside the hospital bed when the night drags on. In that stillness, they lived a different kind of endurance. No glamour, no applause, but real. By the late 2000s, distance began to appear. Not like a storm, but like dust settling on a guitar. No one touches anymore. They were still kind to each other, but the rhythm was gone. In 2008, after 12 years, Ray returned to Australia. Neil stayed behind, older, quieter, in a house with all its furniture intact, but missing the warmth of another human being. And that stretch of loneliness was the most dangerous of all. It made no noise, but it eroded. Neil still belonged to the stage, still had strangers singing along in faraway places. Only now, when he returned to his room, what awaited him was no longer a dream, but a deeply human fear, ending everything alone. After Ray Farley left in 2008, Neil Diamond was left with an emptiness that was hard to name. He was still a legend, still surrounded by stages and roaring applause. Yet the older he became, the more clearly he understood that spotlights could never replace a real person. Someone who stays beside you when everything goes quiet. In his 60s, Neil no longer loved impulsively, but he also wasn't ready to accept a life ending in solitude. And it was in that stretch of life that seemed destined to repeat itself that Katie McNeil entered, quietly, practically without noise. Katie was nearly 3 decades younger than Neil. They first met in 2007 when she worked with Irving Azoff and asked to handle Neil's business because of her genuine love for his music. At first, the connection was purely professional, but over time, closeness formed in the most dangerous way possible. They began seeing the real human being behind the fame. Katie understood boundaries and hesitated at times. Neil wasn't chasing romance either. What drew them together was steady presence. Someone who could remain calm under blinding lights and stay when things became difficult. This love didn't erupt like fireworks. It grew out of habit. Out of the way, having each other became so normal that not having each other started to feel unnatural. After about a year, Neil announced their engagement in September 2011. On April 21, 2012, they married at the Beverly Hills Hotel in a private ceremony. Katie became Neil's 3rd wife and stepmother to his 4 children. This marriage stood on something deeply real. Neil did not want to travel through a glorious journey only to find himself alone at the end of the road. Time answered for them. Nearly 14 years have passed, and the relationship has endured not because of romantic vows, but because of friendship, of mutual support through both comfort and illness. And just when Neil thought he had finally reached his most peaceful harbor, fate prepared another test, not aimed at his heart, but striking straight at his body, at his right to stand on stage, and at the very thing that had defined him all his life. After 3 marriages and countless moments when it seemed he had finally found home, Neil Diamond still touched a kind of loneliness that love could not fill. This was not the pain of a man who failed at marriage, but a quiet family grief, the sorrow of a son and of a younger brother. Late at night, when the house was silent and Katie had fallen asleep, Neil would lie awake staring at the ceiling for a long time, no longer hearing applause, as memory pulled him back to Brooklyn, to his father and to the name he clung to like an anchor, Harvey. His father, Akiba Keeve Diamond, was a small businessman, private and strict. Neil grew up with the image of a father doing whatever work he could, carrying the weight in silence so the family would not collapse. He rarely spoke, but when he did, every word became a rule for living. During the war years when he had to be away from home, Kiev sent letters back, not describing fear, but speaking of patience and faith. From those letters, Neil learned a slow, steady rhythm of storytelling, something that would later shape the ballads he became known for. In the mid-1980s, when Neil was at his busiest and his name was being called the most, cancer appeared. He dropped his schedule, sat beside the hospital bed, held the hand of the father who had once led him through Brooklyn. Campbell passed away, and Neil fell into a long stretch of silence. The guitar went quiet, the music gathered dust, and the fear of never being able to write again closed in. Neil held on to his older brother Harvey as if clinging to the last post, still standing. The two brothers had grown up shoulder to shoulder in cramped apartments, sharing an old radio and a dream far too big for their neighborhood. Harvey lived quietly without needing the spotlight, but he was always the first person to hear Neil sing. Fame expanded Neil's world until it seemed endless, while Harvey's world stayed small and steady. And that very contrast made Harvey feel like home, the one place where Neil did not have to perform. In the early 2000s, Harvey became ill. Neil kept performing, but inside he was stretched tight as a guitar string. When the call came, he left the stage behind and flew home, determined to see the man who had believed in him long before the world even knew his name. Harvey died in absolute silence, a silence that was not a pause, but a loss. Neil withdrew for a time, because when you lose the first person who ever believed in you, all success suddenly starts to feel fragile. That grief carried on to his mother, Rose. She didn't belong to the stage, but she was the very first sound Neil ever loved. A thin voice, sometimes slightly off-key, rising through the cramped Brooklyn apartment. Rose held the family together through sewing, cooking, prayer, and gentleness. She taught Neil to work with integrity, to keep his dignity, and to let the work speak for itself. Fame took Neil everywhere, but his mother's voice still found him. Phone calls before shows, half prayer and half reminder that he still belonged somewhere. In 2006, Rose's heart began to weaken. Neil left the stage again, sitting beside her as life slowed down. Before she passed, she left him a short sentence that cut straight through him. "Just keep singing." After that, Neil placed her photo on his piano. There were nights when he stared at it for a long time, as if waiting for a nod. And he understood. Some people don't leave. You just feel them move deeper inside you. In his later songs, whether written for stadiums or for a small room, there was always the same constant undertone. The hum of a mother who once sang to him so he could dare to believe in tomorrow long before the world was willing to listen. When Neil said goodbye to his mother, he suddenly realized he was standing on a strange edge of life, not simply growing old, but reaching a point where fewer and fewer people still understood who he truly was before the stage lights swallowed everything. His father was gone. His brother was gone. The faces that once made up home now existed only in memory, and in the songs he had written the way some people write to save themselves from collapsing. Yet within all those empty spaces, there was still one friend Neil regarded as the last voice that had accompanied him for decades, a kind of harmony that made the long road feel less cold. Glenn Campbell. They were alike in that they both rose from humble beginnings, both understood that the real cost of fame was not money, but long nights on the road, empty hotel rooms, conversations left unfinished because of tour schedules, and loneliness even when standing before an ocean of people. They had known each other since the late 1960s, when American music was burning bright, impulsive, and no one wanted to stand still. And from the first time they worked near each other, Neil sensed this was not the kind of friendship that needed to be performed. It wasn't built on reputation, but on a professional understanding, an understanding of the weight of a song, of that moment backstage when all the cheering dies out and an artist is left with nothing but himself. Neil once said they didn't need to talk much. They only needed to look at each other, because both of them had lived too long with things outsiders could not even name. Time deepened that friendship quietly. Studio sessions that stretched until morning, phone calls ending in exhausted laughter, tour rides where sometimes silence was the most honest companionship. And then, when Glenn began battling Alzheimer's, the truth became almost unbearable. An artist who lived by memory was having his memory taken away, piece by piece. Neil was among the first to reach out because he understood that this kind of loss makes no noise, yet it erodes a person faster than any fall. He admitted that pain in a way that was unmistakably Neil. No drama, no embellishment, just one short sentence heavy enough to tighten the throat that his heart broke watching his friend grow weaker. And the only thing left to do was keep Glenn's music playing, as a way of keeping him in the world a little longer. When Glenn died in 2017, the loss landed heavier than any applause. Neil didn't appear to pour out grief, didn't chase cameras to turn sorrow into an event. He left only a brief farewell, simple, painful, and true, like a cut. Goodbye to the friend who taught him how to find light, even when the melody fades. And after that, everything returned to the familiar rhythm of his life. A silent room, a piano, and a man who had endured so much loss he no longer cried out loud. He sat there, placed his hands on the cold keys, and softly hummed a tune, half his own, half Glenn's, because sometimes friendship doesn't leave with death. It only transforms into sound, into memory, into an unfinished song the heart keeps playing without even realizing it, as if still waiting for the other person to answer. Neil Diamond once believed that farewells were the cruelest part of being human, until he understood there is a goodbye even more terrifying, when what is leaving you has no face, no voice, only a body silently betraying itself. It began so small, almost harmless, the way most great tragedies do. A slight tremor in the fingertips, a cup slipping from his hand like an ordinary clumsiness of age, a moment spent struggling too long with a button, and then even the things that had once been instinct, keeping time, gripping the guitar, releasing words at exactly the right moment, slowly became exhausting negotiations. The man who once needed only a single gesture to lift an entire stadium to its feet now had to gather every ounce of will just to make his hands obey. And the most frightening part was this. Day after day, he kept telling himself it was only fatigue, only temporary, until he realized this was not a passing rainstorm. It was winter arriving. But if illness feels like an unexpected blow, Neil Diamond had met it long ago. Only back then, he had beaten it in a way that made his whole life believe he was invincible. In 1979, at the height of his brilliance, he collapsed on stage under the lights as applause turned into panic. What awaited him behind the curtain was not an encore, but a hospital. Not cheers, but the cold conclusion of doctors. A tumor on his spine, a 12-hour surgery, and the possibility of losing the one thing that made him who he was. People spoke in terms of life and death, while Neil could think of only one simple question. If he woke up, would he still be himself? In that moment, he hurriedly wrote a few lines like a letter to his children, not because he wanted to leave, but because he feared one day he might have to leave without ever getting to say what mattered. He survived. He returned. And for the next 4 decades, he sang as if repaying that debt to life. The greater the success, the deeper the exhaustion, the more he was loved, the more alone he became. The more legendary he seemed, the more he had to pretend he was fine. That is why when 2018 arrived, what happened felt like fate collecting a delayed payment. Parkinson's. Those 3 words do not kill instantly. They do something far more brutal. They take away small pieces of you until you're still alive, but no longer in control of yourself. It does not strike like an accident. It enters slowly, patiently, and never negotiates. For a performing artist, Parkinson's is not merely an illness. It is a thief of rhythm, a breaker of balance, the hand that cuts the power to the stage at the very moment people still want one more song. For a long time, Neil tried to keep everything the same. He kept touring, kept appearing, kept smiling at the cameras out of the trained habit of a legend who is not allowed to be weak. But behind the scenes, he began living in a state of vigilance over his own body, as if it were a friend preparing to betray him. Each time he walked onto a stage, he had to defeat his legs before he could defeat the crowd. Each time he held the microphone, he had to defeat the tremor before he could defeat the song. It was the kind of battle no one could see, and that made it even lonelier. Then one day he stood before the mirror and realized that what was changing was not the lighting, not simply age, but identity. The man in the mirror was still Neil Diamond, yet he was no longer the Neil Diamond of yesterday. And in that moment, he understood. There are battles where if you keep insisting on winning, you will lose in the most painful way. He made the hardest decision of his life, to step away from touring, to step away from the stage. Not because he loved music any less, but because he loved it too much to let it end in fracture. That farewell left millions with a lump in their throats, because the audience was not merely witnessing a legend become ill. They were watching a man learn how to let go of the one thing he had used to survive. And if divorces had taken homes away from him, Parkinson's took something even deeper, the right to be himself on stage. Today, at 84, his body moves more slowly. Gestures that once burned with intensity are now careful, and each day can feel different. Some days as gentle as a ballad, other days as heavy as a long silence that refuses to end. But in his home in Colorado, surrounded by snow and mountains, Neil holds on to one thing: music as the rope pulling him back from the dark. The piano is still there. The keys are still waiting. Some days his hands tremble too much and he touches it only lightly, as if asking permission. Some days he manages a few notes, and those few notes are enough to remind him he has not disappeared. And Katie, the woman who entered his life later than even fame, has become his strongest anchor, quiet but unwavering. No more endless performances, no more schedules that turn home into a hotel. No more glory forcing him to be strong. Only real days now, caregiving, listening, staying. Sometimes love is no longer fire. It is a hand placed on your shoulder at the exact moment you are weakest, and it does not demand words. The world still sings his music. Sweet Caroline still echoes through stadiums, still has that moment when entire crowds rise together like a ritual that never dies. But now, it is no longer only a song of celebration. It feels like testimony that the man lived brightly enough that the music can keep living on its own, even when he no longer stands under the lights. Perhaps that is the final tragedy and the final comfort. Neil Diamond no longer performs for the world, but the world still carries his voice in its mouth. Parkinson's may take balance, may take speed, may take control, but it cannot take what has already been planted inside collective memory. And in a quiet room in Colorado, when he softly hums through the night, what remains is not fear. It is a gentle truth. Sometimes a person does not win by standing tall, but by holding on to the melody, even when the hands are trembling. In his later years, Neil Diamond no longer needed to prove who he was. He had done that for more than half a century, through songs that people didn't merely listen to, but lived with. When Parkinson's forced him to step away from the stage, a paradox unfolded. Neil Diamond disappeared from the spotlight, yet somehow appeared everywhere. His legacy doesn't live in numbers or records, though there are far too many to count. It lives in something simpler and more powerful. The moment the first few notes begin, a crowd of strangers instantly becomes a single voice. Sweet Caroline is no longer just a song. It's a reflex. A chorus that can lift an entire stadium to its feet, singing as if they're holding a shared memory no one needs to explain. And official recognition arrived in the most proper way possible. Neil Diamond was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2011, a stamp of confirmation that he wasn't just a hit writer, but someone who helped shape American popular music itself. Then in 2018, he received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, not for one brilliant season, but for a lifetime of endurance, where each song feels like a slice of the heart. But what makes that legacy last the longest isn't any golden statue. It's something profoundly human. Neil Diamond always wrote as if he were speaking to one person alone in the dark. He didn't use music to impress. He used it to pull people out of loneliness. His love songs weren't flashy. They carried the warmth of a kitchen at home, the sound of a voice behind a door, the gentleness of someone who is hurting, yet still trying to be kind. And then, when time had stretched long enough to turn a legend into art, his story found another form. A beautiful noise. The Neil Diamond musical on Broadway helped a new generation understand that this man wasn't made only of famous choruses, but also of silences, full of scratches and scars. Perhaps that is Neil Diamond's true legacy. He didn't just write music, he wrote a place where people can stand inside a crowd and still feel protected. A place where every time the chorus rises, we suddenly remember some artists aren't born merely to entertain, but to make life feel less cold. And that is why, even though he no longer stands under the lights, the world still sings him, like it is singing a part of itself. And so, after all the stages that once trembled under his voice, after the choruses that made an entire nation rise and sing like a ritual, Neil Diamond's life moved into a different rhythm, the rhythm of silence. No more tour buses, no more nights of forcing himself to burn bright. Only a man who has traveled the long road of fame, now learning to slow down as if writing the final notes for himself. Now, at 84, Neil Diamond lives a life that feels like the closing verse of an unforgettable ballad. Few words, deep feeling, and a gentle light. His net worth is estimated at around $300 million, a figure that can leave people stunned. Yet for Neil, it is only a shadow cast behind a much larger truth. 6 decades of relentless work, sold-out tours, and songs that have lodged themselves into the American memory like a piece of youth. Every dollar has its price, not only in labor, but in the years he had to trade away peace just to keep the music from going out. He chose Colorado as the place to stop. There, on the mountainside, Neil lives on an estate valued at roughly $8 million. Spacious but never showy, luxurious, yet carrying the discreet restraint of someone who has grown tired of noise. The house seems to float between snow and pine forests, where the air always carries the cold scent of the mountains and a quietness that feels like a blanket laid over the mind. Inside, light pours through wide glass panels and lands on gold and platinum records on the wall, not like trophies, but like memories that have cooled, leaving only a silent glow. The room that makes you believe he is still Neil Diamond is not the living room, but a private studio beside a window facing the Rocky Mountains. There sits a grand piano, its keys slightly worn, worn by years, not by neglect. Each time morning sunlight touches the glass, people say Neil still sits there, writing when he can, testing a few chords, slowly, as if speaking with his own memories. In the garage, old objects tell the story for him. A 1968 Cadillac Eldorado bought when he first touched the summit. A Bentley Continental that recalls years of glory, and a Mercedes S-Class for the quiet drives he now loves most. Somewhere farther away, there is still a small yacht docked at Marina del Rey, the place he once went to let the sea speak what he never wanted to explain. But his most precious keepsake isn't behind glass or made of steel. It lives in that Colorado home, where Neil still keeps an old guitar, the $9 guitar of his youth, the one that opened the first door. And beside it, a framed lyric sheet of Sweet Caroline, like a gentle reminder. His life began with a small dream and ended with a legacy too large for anyone to forget. Some artists spend their whole lives trying to prove they are great. Neil Diamond didn't. He didn't try to be great one more time. At the end, he chose to finish with something rarer: peace. No more packed schedules. No more nights of forcing himself under the lights while his body betrayed him. Now there are only quiet mornings, a home that still breathes, and a woman beside him. Not to gaze up at a legend, but to hold the hand of a man. And that is Neil Diamond's most beautiful paradox. He spent his whole life writing about love, yet only in the later years did he truly get to live inside it. A love that demands no stage, no new hit, no strength, only that he still exists. But Neil Diamond was never only a singer. He was a songwriting superstar, a man who wrote music powerful enough to keep him in the world, even after he left the stage. And so, he can be silent, but the music cannot. Sweet Caroline still rises in stadiums and bars, in the moments when people need a line of song to rescue themselves from loneliness. Not because Neil Diamond is immortal, but because he left behind something nearly immortal, a piece of an entire nation's memory. And you? What Neil Diamond song has stayed with you the longest? Leave a comment below. And if you want to keep exploring lives that were dazzling on the surface, yet full of hidden wounds behind the spotlight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. So I'll see you again in the next story.